University of Manchester. It's a covert network project. So it's based on using a method called social network analysis. And what we're trying to find out is whether networks that work in secrecy and in kind of underground capacities, are they different from the networks that we kind of experience more openly in overt like political organisations? So if you're a paid up member of the Labour Party, is that different to being a terrorist in the IRA? Apart from the fact that one is committing a crime and the other isn't, but do they function differently? So I'm also here kind of in the capacity of my own personal experience as an activist. And so I'm involved in a lot of feminist activism, arts activism, music-based activism. That's kind of the reason why I came to sociology and my interest in networks in the first place. So I've done a lot of work with groups like Ladyfest, organising feminist music festivals. So I'm interested in how organisations work, how people can get together, make things happen, often on low budget. So lots of places put on arts events, but how do they do it? How do people kind of get together to do these things? So today I'm going to talk about the kind of covert aspect of things, but I want you to chip in at any point if you kind of don't understand anything, or if you want to ask a question, because I don't really want to just do a full-on presentation here, even though I've got lots of slides. It's because it's quite a visual thing actually, and it's easier to talk about things when you've got visual representations of them. So networks function best, or they're easier to understand when you can see the pictures of them and how people or organisations are connected to each other. So I thought I'd put a provocative title in there. I'm not really going to talk about Somali pirates, although we do have Somali pirates in our data set. So what we're doing at the moment is collecting lots of data. So we're at the early stages. We don't really know what we're going to find yet, so it's quite exciting. So people all around the world are kind of sending data sets to us, so everything from Somali pirates to the IRA and lots in between. So what is a covert network? Anybody want to kind of chip in what they think a covert network is all about? Hopefully by the end of this you'll have lots of opinions on that. So just a definition, a covert network is a social network which has one or many elements of secrecy about it. So we think really the main thing that makes a covert network stand out from other types of networks is there's an element of secrecy, something that people in the group or the organisation want to keep secret. That's not necessarily something illegal, but it's maybe you just want to kind of function in a way that not everybody else in your local vicinity or your social group knows about. So network members might try and keep their identities secret. For example, if you're a member of a criminal organisation, the network may form around activities that need to be kept secret for specific reasons. Maybe you're involved in a particular type of activist event and you want to get to the point where you can do the event, but you don't want to be intercepted along that way to make that event happen. So maybe you want to keep your planning activities covert or secret along the way. Doesn't mean you're necessarily doing anything illegal, but you want to make sure the event happens. So you need to kind of keep those planning activities secret. And then there's the aspect of kind of social movements, so people like the suffragettes, those who went and fought for women's rights to vote first, their activities were highly covert and it was really important. They kept a front as to, you know, they were proper ladies in society, they did things in proper ways, but behind the scenes they were planning radical actions and events and getting involved in criminal and quite dangerous activities as well. So there's lots of different reasons behind why we want to keep a network covert or kind of secret. So do networks matter at all, do you think? So if we all think about it, we all have networks in our daily life in every capacity. So everything from your family network, friendship network, colleagues, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're completely separate, sometimes you want to keep your different networks separate. If you just look at your Facebook page, if you happen to have one of those Facebook pages or other social networking tools, it might seem like a huge mass of people, but actually you can start to see patterns in how people are associated with each other in different sub-networks within a larger network. So they matter because you might want to keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer. And if you ever heard of the phrase birds of a feather flock together, well, that's a really important concept in social network analysis. So the idea is similar people do things together because of those similarities, or do people become more similar to each other because they engage in particular activities? So it's one of these sociological questions that nobody can answer and everybody's always arguing about. Do people become like each other because they hang out together, or do they get attracted to each other because they have the same political views or they have the same attitudes to life? So are there really differences between overt, which are obviously the less secret type of networks, and covert networks? We don't really know yet, and that's what we're hoping to find out from this project. So there hasn't been an awful lot of work done on the area of covert networks. There's been single kind of projects done on specific groups, like people looking at isolated terrorist networks, or they're just looking at specific events. But no one's really kind of drawn them all together to see if there really is something going on with a covert network that is different to an overt network. And lots of people have vested interests in trying to understand whether covert networks actually matter or whether they function differently as well. So we want to think about things like, what role does trust and secrecy play in a network? Is it really, really important that you trust those that are around you? If you want to get involved in some activity and you need to gather people of a similar disposition, you really have to develop a trust between those different individuals to form a group in order to make an action happen, or to have some sort of an outcome to that. So trust is really important. And so just how did Walt keep his meth lab secret, and who was he really connected to? We'll take a quick look at that as we go through. Even though it's a fictional network, I think it's quite interesting. So if anyone has watched Breaking Bad, can I just see? Okay, well, we've got quite a few people. Don't spoil the end, I have 4 episodes to go. Right, so I'm that close to the end. So I've kind of made it through most of the way. I'm saving it so I can do them back to back. So no spoilers. Do social network structures matter? So that's the question we're trying to answer as well. And can understanding them make us better able to organise and mobilise our own activist networks? That's kind of a research aim for me personally, but also I kind of want to understand that, and does it affect how we organise as activists as well? So what do you think a covert population might be? And by population, I don't just mean like lots and lots and lots of people, but I just mean a group. So what might be a covert group or a covert type of activity that people might get involved with?
Police work.
Police work, yeah.
Religious.
Yes, yeah, well, yes, it could be, obviously, if it's like a secret kind of religion or a cult or certain parts of it. Yeah, so you might be engaged in covert activities.
Pedophiles?
Yes, yeah. We actually do have a data set on that, which is quite harrowing. But yeah, it's definitely a covert network.
Backwards.
Yeah.
Rapes.
Yes. Oh, you're brilliant. Things are coming up here. So, got heroin users, clubbers, men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women, swingers, terrorists, clients of sex workers, youth gangs, illegal immigrants, corrupt policemen, criminals, persecuted Jews. Anything else?
Graffiti.
Which?
Graffiti. Graffiti.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't have that one on that, but that's a good one, yeah.
Corporate cartels.
Yes. Now you're getting the hang of it. So we've got online fraudsters, drug dealers. This isn't an endless list here. Child pornographers, people with infectious diseases, militants, ravers, Freemasons, cyclists, critical mass movement. Keeping our cycling really covert these days. And it's child sex offenders. So when you start thinking about it, everyone knows about all these things, but you mightn't have thought about them in how they operate and how they function as a covert network. So they keep their activities secret for some or one or many reasons. And what we want to try and understand then is how people within those networks are tied together. So what kinds of relationships do they have with each other? And in networks we call the relationship a tie. So a tie can be anything from, I have a personal relationship with you, we're friends, we're lovers, we're family members, we could be co-workers. Our ties can also be, we share the same roles, so we're both leaders, we're both political activists, so that they can be lots of different ways. So it's important to try and define what kind of ties we're interested in as well when we're looking at covert networks. So these are some of the ones that we kind of came up with: exchanging money, being in the same gang, taking drugs together, being arrested with somebody at the same time. That's actually creating a tie. That's important if we look at the suffragette data. So a lot of the suffragette network data that we have generated has come from archive data, and some of that has been on who's been arrested with whom and who shared prison cells together or who were in the same prison at the same time. So because of that, then there's some sort of strong tie between people. Things like sharing resources, committing fraud, planning events with, communicating with people, so emailing, phoning, living near people, so being in a community, being on the same street. They can be types of ties. Sharing needles or sexual partners, reporting to or managing people, so the leadership kind of aspect. You could have moved countries together, migrated together, immigrated together. You could have grassed on people together.
Sorry, what's BBB? The last one that was on there.
Oh, it's gone back too far, sorry. Sorry, I know, it skipped back. Okay, right. Anyway, just so you actually get to see all these again. Just really embed them in your minds.
Only for me, though.
Oh, how terribly boring. There must be a faster way to do this.
Austin Powers slow.
I know, yeah. I'll just take a sip of tea. Anyone want to sing a song?
There you go.
Yeah. I'm destined never to answer that, right? That was my colleague put that one in, and she comes from a medical background, so I presume it's medical genetics, sharing the same type of genetic code or something. I'm not quite sure about that one, so I won't pretend I do. Theories, it's a bit blurry, so what we want to try and figure out is what kinds of theories will help us understand covert networks. So what are the kind of important things that we want to figure out? So the roles and positions that people have within networks are important. So whether somebody's a leader, are they the initiator, are they someone that's what we call a broker, so somebody that kind of exists in between subgroups. So maybe the information goes between them and nobody else, and that's the only way that two groups are connected. The secrecy of the network, so how information will travel through the network, how secure that might be. And we can talk about networks in lots of different ways, both personal networks and online networks. So a lot of what we talk about can be applied in different contexts as well. So these are a lot of the kind of ideas that we're trying to unpack by looking at covert networks to see what really kind of comes out and are they different from overt networks. So if we think about types of covert networks, if you think about being a full-time activist, this really takes up most of one's life if you're a full-time activist. Whereas if you go to sex parties once in a while, it might only take up a little bit of your life, unless you're Michael Douglas, and that's a different matter. Freemasons, so you could be part of the business community, a member of Freemasons. They're really, 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 really secretive, and they really claim that they're not. Is there any Freemasons in here? You're going to reveal yourselves. And they claim not to be a secret society, but just have an interest in secret societies. And apparently they have a really extensive secret library that nobody is allowed to actually go and see, which I'd love to get in. But I'm not a Freemason. So they tend to be integrated into wider networks. So Freemasons work everywhere. They do things you don't really know that they exist in your network. I probably have Freemasons in my network, don't know about it. Whereas militant factions are segregated from wider networks, so they need to keep themselves separate for very different reasons. If you're seeking out a marital affair, then you're thinking about actions are controlled by the individuals. That's one or two people, one person going to look for another partner outside of their marriage. That's just controlled by one individual. It has no impact on anybody else making those decisions except that individual. Whereas if you've been tasked to become a suicide bomber, then your actions can be controlled by a network because you've been given orders, you've been told to do something. So you have very little kind of free will on that capacity if you decided to go down that route. Getting high, it's an individual aim, but it may be done in a group setting. Votes for women, a network aim, so we talk about the suffragettes, that's a social movement, so that has an aim that is bigger than the individuals, but has individual benefit. If we think about being jailed, that's an individual consequence of an action. And then arrest at an all union members, that's network consequences. So if you've been arrested and you're part of a union, that has an impact on your union membership because you've done something that has affected the group. So it's just trying to unpack whether there's individual consequences or actions or whether they're group consequences or actions. And basically wherever you are on this whole kind of mixed up structure affects the network structure as well. But, having said that, is that just a covert network thing? All the same things happen in overt networks as well. So your personal decisions, individual decisions impact on your personal networks just as group decisions in public impact on the groups or organisations that you might be involved with in an overt capacity. So we're trying to figure out really, yeah, did you have a question? Okay. We're trying to figure out really, are there differences between the two? We did delete blank pages, but they have reappeared. So this is a technical term, bipartite, but don't worry about that because that just means two things, so a network of two things. So if we think about people participating in social events, so before we were just kind of talking about just networks generally, so we've lots of things happening. Now we want to see whether people participating at events has an impact. People belonging to voluntary organisations, so there's two kinds of networks going on in these. There's the individuals within the organisation and there's the organisations themselves. So for example, directors sitting on corporate boards, there's often interlocking directorates which try to take over the whole corporate world by having strategic people on boards with similar agendas. So we have one person maybe sitting on 5 or 6 different boards and trying to control the agenda setting on that. So that's not a covert network, but maybe it is. We don't really know what goes on behind closed doors. So that's just looking at individuals and the organisations, so the individuals within the organisations, and then often we have connections between organisations. So if you think about activist groups and say art activism, very, very rarely do we kind of exist in isolation. There's usually some sort of collaboration, contact, support between different groups and organisations, particularly in the voluntary sector or not-for-profit, because we need to pool resources a lot of the time in order to get things done. So there's lots of kind of complex network stuff going on here. Covert networks are embedded in multiplex settings, so that just means there's lots of complex things going on. And we talk about networks in a multi-level capacity, meaning there's an organisation, there might be several layers of kind of management, lower management, and then the workers. So that's like a pyramid structure almost, so it's a multi-level setting. So the whole entire thing as an organisation is a network, but then there's all these other sub-networks happening. With covert networks, we're kind of trying to make the distinction between the covert and the overt, but it's really not binary because in our daily lives, everybody has covert networks going on to some degree. Things that you don't say to someone because you might hurt their feelings, but several people might know. That's a little network of secrecy going on. White lies, that's a little network of secrecy between people. So it's just about unpacking those that are kind of inconsequential and those that actually have an impact somewhere out there in the world. It's complex. Is everyone okay so far? Does anyone want to pitch in or anything? Now we get to the man in the underpants. So if we just use Walt's Walt's network as an example. So this is Breaking Bad. For anyone who doesn't know Breaking Bad, does anyone want to give a quick synopsis without giving it away? Is there anybody here who wants to watch it really soon? Basically, it's based around this character, Walter. So it's like what we call an ego network. So it's based on one individual, and we're working out to build the network out from one person. Rather than starting with the organization, we're starting with the individual and building his network out. So he gets some bad news that he's suffering from cancer, thinks he's terminally ill. How is he going to make some money to support his family when he's gone? He's a chemistry teacher who turns to making methamphetamine. And he does a really, really good job because he's very diligent at it. But how does he do that? He starts to draw people in from his network in different settings, and they begin to cross over as his kind of pathway gets more complicated. So the networks started off extremely separate, and then they start to kind of get crowded and overlap. Will he start making mistakes? What will happen to the networks? So here he is, and here's his chemistry lab. So if we were thinking about the multi-level capacity, the classroom here is where it all began, where he has his equipment. He uses this as the first place to kind of access the tools he needs. This is his wife and her sister. So we can see the pathway along as the connections. So each line represents a tie. And then her husband, he likes doing home brew, but there's a little bit more to it than that. He's connected to Walt through those two people. So there's a connection with 2 steps removed. So he's not directly related, but there's 2 people in between, but it's a close tie nonetheless. And Hank's role is part of the Drug Enforcement Agency. So remember I said earlier, keep your friends close but your enemies closer. Well, Walt is a fine example of doing that. You couldn't get much closer. So he's got one of the highest serving officers in his immediate family, while he's got the biggest methamphetamine supply in the whole of North and South America going on under his nose. So that's one of the DA colleagues, and the house where it all starts to kick off, where Hank lives. And then we have Jesse over there in the corner, who was a former student of Walt's. So Jesse's really important. Jesse takes the flak for everything because he looks like a drug dealer, whereas Walt is like the pillar of society. So the network, you can see, is starting to get complex and complicated, but everybody's actually quite well connected, but are unaware of each other's activities for a very, very long time. That doesn't last forever, by the way, but I won't give the whole thing away. And this is actually a network that they put together in the series themselves, and right in the middle is Gus Fring. So this is who they think is the mastermind of the whole entire thing. So Walt has done a really good job of keeping his network so covert. He's not in the picture anywhere, but a lot of people are popping up here, like Jesse's popping up in this network as well. So even in a show like this, they've understood that networks matter, that tying links between people matter, trying to understand the patterns and what happens in what order. So they're trying to take out who they think is the key actor, but they have it completely wrong. And I think that's the genius of this show, although I don't know what happens at the end. So covert networks, by virtue of being covert, they're hard to gather information on. So we have sparse information on covert networks. We know bits and pieces. And by virtue of the fact that we have any information on covert networks means they were a bit rubbish at being covert because they got caught at some point in time. They slipped up. So either people have got arrested, or they've completed their action by committing suicide through a suicide bomb, and we know the outcome of that. The covert network has kind of become overt in some way, and it's obviously a little bit flawed if we know about it. Having said that, there's lots of missing data, so it's really hard for us to kind of unpick what's happening. And that's what we're trying to overcome doing this project.
What about covert networks that are no longer relevant? So the project is done, they're finished. After that, do you find people are willing to open up after the fact and release data?
The best way we can go about that is through archive data. I think people depends on what it is. The Swingers network, which we don't have access to, but a researcher is going to do some analysis for us. Everybody loves talking about that example. She has really good data on that, because while nobody knows within their own networks that they're swingers, they were quite willing to give the information for the project to their via their GPs, because it was part of like improving their sexual health. So we have way more data on that, and they're quite open about talking about it, and she managed to do a lot of interviews with them. So that's kind of unique. When it comes to things like people who have been involved in terrorist organisations, they still really tend to not talk about things. So we have to go through kind of anything in the archives, so police reports, piece things together. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle. Go through police reports, convictions, court reports, media, anything that's written in the newspapers. Just it's a detective thing, trying to fill in the gaps. So sometimes historical networks are good, but then history is written in a certain way by certain people with a particular agenda, so we don't always know that that's really good data either. So we're always questioning it. We try and do the best that we can. Yeah, so it's tricky. It's tricky to find out things. So collecting data, what we're interested in is the operation, so the activity, what is the thing that is happening, who takes responsibility, are they organisations, are we interested in organisations, or individuals, or both? Who are the covert actors, so who are they tied to? The thing about doing social network analysis is we take the data security really, really seriously, because unlike doing surveys and other kinds of research, you can't anonymise people at the point of data collection, because otherwise you've no idea who's connected to who or what organisations are connected. So if you're actually just in social network analysis in general, you need to be able to find out who's connected to who. Then you carefully anonymise the data, and you make sure that you keep your different files separate, so it's harder for people to piece together. You change settings. You wouldn't divulge an exact city location or give too much description. If the group is still active and they need to keep their information secret, you certainly would be very careful about giving any information. It's good practice as well within this kind of work, if you're doing social network analysis, to feed back to the group and make sure they're happy with how they're being represented, that they feel their data is not compromised in some way or other. So that's kind of just a procedural thing. So this is kind of what we want to do. We generate visualizations, the statistics behind it, but often the visualizations help us understand what's happening in the structures. So if we think about the squares on this, for example, a red square here will be an organization, and we're interested in connections between organizations, which are people. So, for example, they're an organization, or an event, if you think about attending the same festival together or attending the same political rally together. So that could be an event or an organization, but people are connected because they've gone to the same event. And often you find that people tend to go to similar events or frequent the same events. So it builds up strength of connections and ties between people over time. So tracking that over time is really interesting to see how networks develop and what happens and who kind of gravitates towards each other. So it's back to that idea of birds of a feather flock together. So are we attracted to each other because we have the same political aims, and I keep seeing you at the same rallies and we're at the same demonstrations all the time, so we become friends and then start going to the same events and activities together. So it's just about building up the picture as we go along. So if we pop back, it's probably a bit small, but thinking about the Breaking Bad example, if you just put in organizations, so we're talking about the red squares, like the DEA is an organization, so how's the organization connected to different events going on? So you want to trace things back. Often what we do with networks is you're kind of starting with an end thing and you're working back to try and understand the process that got you to that end point. But where I'm keen in kind of utilising network data is to try and see if we can predict or if we can kind of improve on what we do from the knowledge that we have. So if we know how a network might function most efficiently in a particular setting, in a particular context with certain types of people and events happening, can we then kind of plan to kind of make future, say, activist organisations more efficient, less prone to kind of falling apart? I don't know whether that's possible to do that. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the idea of a broker. So you have somebody or an organisation or an individual who's the gateway between different groups. The US government in particular is really, really keen on understanding terrorist cell networks for very good reasons. To try and understand who are the really important people. It's often not those who are most vocal in the front, it's often not the spokesperson. So you want to try and figure out, right, which group where is the one that's actually controlling everything. Rather than trying to kill all of them everywhere at all time, if they can kind of be confident that this cell is the most important one, if you take that out, will the network just fall apart by itself because there's nobody left to gel it together. So that's the idea of kind of a broker. In everyday life, there's brokers all the time. Sometimes you might be acting as a broker, any one of you here, because you feel like everybody's coming to me for everything and I just have to keep telling this person that, but there's nobody else that can answer these questions. I'm stuck in the middle. But if you decide to walk away, what happens to the organisation? Does it fall apart? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But with a lot of voluntary organisations, there's often people who have a heavy burden, and it's really, I think it's really useful to be able to understand the stresses that some people in a network can be under because they've just got too much information to deal with or too many tasks to do, that sometimes you don't recognise that until you can take a step back. So maybe you can put extra supports in to help that person, or maybe you see within a network in a country scale, so say for example we're talking about the Green Party, and we see there's lots of people in Brighton, obviously in the Green Party, and that's fine. There's a couple of people up in Salford and they're just struggling, but there's a goodwill there, but they don't have enough support. So maybe you should kind of filter extra support at particular times to kind of enable the Green Party to flourish in that particular area. So it's about understanding how the network functions rather than just looking about, okay, votes came in there, we'll just keep our, all our eggs in one basket and just keep going with the safe bet. So that's just one example of trying to understand how networks function. So as I mentioned earlier, we've been thinking about networks on individuals or on organisations. So individuals are affiliated to organisations, going back to the idea of multi-level. So we've all the people at the end, and we've got the organisations, which would be a classroom within a school, within a district, and on and on and on, depending on how high up you want to go. And organisations tend not to be isolated from each other. So I'll just do a quick overview of some suffragette network data that a colleague of mine, Gemma Edwards, spent ages in the archives in I think London, Bristol, piecing it all together from letters that they wrote to each other, diaries that were kept, arrest reports, police reports from when they served time together, and newspaper reports. So it was a really, really big project. So if we think about the personal ties of Emmeline Pankhurst, and the events and the visits that happened up Laithways back. So basically this was kind of a safe place for the suffragettes to go, but it was also a space which they could do a lot of their activism planning and kind of organising and, shoring their plans together. Well, what were they doing? They were planting trees. Lovely ladies going drinking tea, planting trees. What could possibly go wrong? So it was owned by a particular family, the Blaithwaite family, and they were, pillars of society, and nobody would suspect a thing. And they were really good to these ladies of leisure, having them down for tea and planting trees. And They kept really good diaries though about everybody who visited, so it's probably one of the most kind of complete sets of data on people who considered themselves to be suffragettes at the time. Obviously the suffragettes were women, but there were quite a few supportive men on the periphery of their network. So the man of the house, who was still obviously pretending he was in charge, but he absolutely had no control whatsoever. So this is Tweedy, but if we think about the suffragettes visiting the Blaithwaites, so all these little dots, you can't really see the lines, they're not very well drawn together, but that's making connections between everybody that visited the house at some stage. So because they visited the house and they had a chance to kind of talk and plan activities or whatever, they started to develop a network. They would never have met each other in their localities if it wasn't for having this space. So if we think about the multi-level aspect, the house is the place where people went. That's one part where a network could form. And then the individuals went there, spent time together, and because they were there, they had contact with each other and they were able to establish a communication network as well in order to get activities done in different parts of the country. So it was a place where they could coordinate their operations, could confide with each other, plan, participate, and execute their goals and their aims. And then I'll leave you with this particular image where the square represents an event, so an event like an action, like some particular arson attack which they were quite fond of doing, setting things on fire. And then the circles represent the individual suffragettes, so it is quite tiny. If you do want to go up and have a look, feel free, I'll just leave that on the screen. So an event ties those people together. So that's a quick overview of where I'm coming from and where the project is coming from in relation to covert networks. I don't have answers to everything. I might be able to answer some questions in general, because as I said, we've only just got data together, so the next stage is to try and work with it and see what comes out and where we might go with it. So I'm keen to kind of get feedback, and if anyone has any ideas about interesting covert networks that you think we should look at, or some sort of, I don't know, anything basically that you want to kind of offer, or any feedback on this, then that would be great, and thank you for having me down.
Which has been your favourite or most interesting network that you've analysed so far, and why?
I've not done the analysis yet, so on these networks. Well, I'm fond of the suffragette stuff for various different reasons. I think because I have a list of things here, so I think some of the most interesting things there, and probably uncomfortable to go through, will be there's a child paedophile ring. And I think it's important for us to be able to understand, it's actually quite harrowing, because you think that these things are very unconnected, but it's so connected between work colleagues. So at what point does someone in work go, I can get you an 11-year-old girl? How does that conversation happen? So it's trying to understand how these, how the networks develop. So it starts off with brothers who then introduce a friend who goes on to somebody else, and all of a sudden in one particular area there's a very large extensive network, and the girls involved in the network are all friends, classmates, so they're not isolated people either. So I think they could be, if we can do something useful with this, it will be trying to kind of see if there's any interventions. Can you actually use networks, can you understand them to kind of maybe see things happening, understand the patterns? Maybe there was a point in time where somebody could have seen something happening within a network that would raise alarm bells. So if you can use networks in that way to understand better, to maybe kind of implement an intervention for something like that. So I think, while it won't be easy going, I just think it could be a very useful thing to do. So hopefully we can get something out of that.
Does the fact that a network has started escalate things? So say your example of the paedophiles, once there is a network, can people be drawn into that may have, in other circumstances, if there wasn't a network, not have succumbed to their baser instincts?
Quite possibly, but that's kind of a psychology question, I reckon, really. But
it's your the
maybe
birds of a feather flock together.
Yeah. Well, yes, but maybe it's opportunity. So what that's presented is an opportunity that wasn't there before. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't have acted on it. Maybe they'd have found some other way to do that. Maybe it would have lain dormant for another 30 or 40 years until another opportunity arose. We don't know those things because that's kind of a psychological question. But having something in place created the opportunity. But when we come back to things like trust, I still don't understand, and this is why I hope something comes out of it. Like, how do you have that conversation? I trust my colleague enough to ask this question. Most people don't ask their colleagues for a drink even, so how does that happen, and how do people know to ask those people? So
Yeah, I was just going to ask, are there different methods of recruitment? There must be different methods of recruitment to different networks, because obviously if it's a legal and open network, you can put an advert in the paper.
So that's really important to us to understand recruitment. So how do people get recruited to the network? That's a really extreme one, like of all of them, that's probably one of the more taboos. It's easier to kind of get recruited to a terrorist network, way easier than that. So we don't know. We want to try and understand are there different methods used to do that.
And also there are maybe methods for recognition. I was reading the other day an article about anorexia and bulimia, and they were saying that the girls recognize each other because, for example, they are wearing a red bracelet or a black bracelet, so they know then who are their parents when you don't any idea, because for you it's just a bracelet that they do recognize.
Yeah, so that's having an outward symbol, that's kind of an indicator of something, yeah. So I think lots of organizations use logos and identifiers, so why would covert networks be any different? But that's a really good example, yeah.
Have you, just kind of in general, from what you've seen before, is there like a certain kind of person, so you're talking about like a broker, is there a certain kind of person who's like more instrumental than other people, or is it like an entirely collective, so that you need everyone in the group for it to function, or is it like if there's one person missing then the group doesn't happen?
All networks are different, but they have similar properties. So I'll give an example. It's not a covert network example, but I can give a better example from Ladyfest. So Ladyfest is a feminist music festival organisation. It's not for profit, but it's kind of random. It springs up anywhere, and a group of volunteers get together and try and plan it. Often they don't know each other, and it can be chaotic and everything. But I did some work on that, and I looked at a group of organisers, and I had 36 in the core network. So there was about 75 altogether, but most of them just sat around the edges, kind of just read emails, didn't do anything else. But when I looked at the structure, it seemed like everyone's coming to the general meetings, and it looked really egalitarian, and everyone's kind of voting and getting stuff done. The people that were most vocal were actually not the most nominated as being central, as being the most important people. And I found that fascinating. It's like, okay, I would expect, yes, they got high nominations, so people said they were important, but it was actually often people who appeared to be on the periphery, and when you look, they were actually brokering different little arts organisations together, so they were drawing in like film and theatre, the quieter things. Music is always a much louder event, and so they were managing to get a lot more of the creative activities done really quietly. If they had disappeared, people would have thought, oh, they just left, but actually a lot of things would have fallen apart if they had gone. But whereas the person, 2 or 3 people who were quite vocal and seemed like they were leaders, if they had gone, things would have continued. So it's about kind of understanding. It won't always be the same people in the same positions, but Psychologists that use social network analysis look at personality traits and types, and they tends to be leader types, but then there tends to be loud people types, which aren't necessarily the same thing. So leaders can actually be quiet and on the side, but they're the ones that are getting things done. So I think from voluntary organisation perspective, trying to understand what's happening within an organisation, especially when there's people that all can't come to meetings, so you don't necessarily know everybody, you don't know them very well, you might vaguely recognise their name or their face, but they can be doing extremely vital work for the group and the organisation, but nobody really knows that, they're just beavering away and getting it done, and if they decided they had enough, well then maybe half your festival falls apart without you realising it. So some roles are more prone to stress than others, so the broker is really important but highly stressful position to be in. So they're the feeder of information, they send the information all around to lots of different groups, but they're also the person that everybody comes to, so it can be quite burdensome. So it's useful to know when people are feeling under pressure, they may actually be genuinely overwhelmed with the amount of activities that they need to do. So it's kind of, that's why I like looking at networks, by standing back you can kind of see what's happening in the overall organisation.
Just because it's interesting, like, so thinking about kind of anarchism and like a non-hierarchical society. Yeah, I mean, just if it was kind of, I know it's kind of a big question, but like if it kind of be possible, like theoretically, you know,
it's almost impossible, to be honest. Non-hierarchical organisations, they're wonderful on paper, but they don't function that way. There are always people carrying the burden of certain activities. There are always people that need to make decisions, because even though you try and make a consensus decision, you still can't always reach a consensus decision. So somebody has to make a decision to move things forward, whether that's openly or whether it's just because I'm going to send this email off, or I'm going to make sure that that meeting room gets booked, or whatever it is. So.
Types of network analysis that you see excuse influence with regards to data mining or the types of programs that they use for social network analysis?
Because I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm more on I use programs to analyze the data, but it is kind of, there's lots of web crawlers out there, there's an awful lot of programs that are open source programs used. A lot of the work that kind of people do from an academic point of view is open source, and a lot of the programs that they write are open source because they kind of want to bring down the system in a way sometimes. So I don't know per se what they use, but it is a really big growth area. So this whole idea of large data, big data is the buzzword. So we can get 10 million billion nodes, and a person is a node, an individual is a node, by harvesting everything across Twitter and Facebook and putting it all together. You have to be careful, because even in a project that was done in the States on Facebook, and it got approval and it was supposed to be all anonymised, someone within 45 minutes was able to identify exactly what university it happened in and the people within the program. So even, you just have to be careful. They released the data and it was just too easy for people who were in the know to kind of reconstruct the data set. So in lots of ways what we're kind of doing is we're reconstructing data sets, because we'll have articles or we'll have archived data and we're reconstructing, but that's from paper mostly. But yeah, it's kind of a big area. Computer scientists, police force in particular, are really trying to get on board with network analysis. In places they do a very bad job of it. So bad network analysis is dangerous. And I'm not joking about that, it is actually dangerous, because if you're not sure about what you're doing and you're making assumptions about who you think is a central actor, like we're looking at Breaking Bad and they have the wrong person, it can be detrimental. So it's not something to mess around with if you're trying to use it for law enforcement capacities, or in kind of like trying to take out terrorist cells. You don't want to make mistakes with that stuff. So we would never advocate people using network analysis to make these you know, really important decisions about things at all. And they need experts on board to do that in order to not actually make really bad decisions about things.
I'll just say PBP, I think is football and virus.
Oh, so that. Thank you very much.
Hey,
Yeah, that's if everyone's happy and there's no more feedback.
Actually, I've got one question. Do groups tend to grow, or is it not that important in analysing a group?
There's kind of a saturation point, and it depends on what the reason for the group in the first place. So bigger is not always better. But what you find with bigger networks is they tend to break down into subgroups. So they kind of naturally form little sub-cliques and subgroups in order to be able to get things done. There seems to be a particular kind of, there's the initiation stage where you have a fixed number of people who start a network. Then there's a growth, like for example with the Ladyfest network, that began, and then within a couple of weeks there was like 150 people who said they wanted to organise the festival. And then that all fell off as the work came in. People dropped out, and the network got smaller and smaller, and then it stabilised. And then they were the core people who actually did the things and got things done. So there tends to be a peak, and then a falling off, and then a stabilisation period.
And what's the timeline for it? For the peak?
It'll be different for every organisation, so I guess it depends on, like with Ladyfest, this was over a 12-month planning period, so with that, within the first 2 months, it peaked. The numbers stayed high because nobody had worked out who was really there and really not, so it was an artificial peak for a few months, and then about 6 months in, dramatic drop off, and then they were able to see who was really in the network, and then who were the core people within the networks, those who actually got stuff done, and then it stabilised during the kind of period just before the festival.
And another question,
Yeah.
you've mentioned saturation points. What are the main reasons for the saturation? How would you identify them?
There'll be loads of different reasons. Again, it depends on
What
what
are the major
particular.
ones?
Yeah. It's just communication overload, and often people are just like, I can't take anymore. So saturation point is like people feel that they can't communicate with each other. That you know the network can't kind of cope with the amount of people that are in it, doing different tasks and activities. So that can be a breaking point for lots of networks, because there's like too many things going on and not enough ways to organise that.
Do you think trendiness and notions of fashion could also influence the saturation point as well?
It could,
Especially,
yeah,
urban
obviously.
ones?
Russell Brand, woohoo, everybody's going to join, anti-capitalist, anti-government organisations, and then nothing.
Yeah.
But nobody's actually really doing anything.
Or
Or
people
they
that
are,
liked it,
you know.
but it was smaller, it's too big, I want out,
Yeah.
you know. this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, there's loads of different things that can have an impact on that. So I don't want to go on too long there because I know somebody else wants to. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.